Thank you again, Herman and Johanna, for all the great work you've done. And again, all the technical people here, all the people that have done the recording, et cetera, tremendously good work to have all this recorded. I think the ITC and this conference is going to be giving a lot of good ideas to help Theosophists to work together more and bring out what the world sorely needs. G.D. Peruker, I think we all know, we've gotten the history, et cetera, so I won't go into much on his history. The Esoteric Tradition, which is 2 volumes, was printed originally about 1935. And I, again, find this book, of all of them, probably be the most important, practically speaking. It gets down to earth, but it stays up in heaven at the same time. It is very much into the deeper aspects of the secret doctrine, which everybody knows can be quite difficult at times. And as I say, my personal prejudice is that everybody should read G.D. Peruker sooner or later, especially these 2 books, because it, I think, will help a very important area of the secret doctrine, the probably magnum opus of Blavatsky. Okay. Next slide, please. All right. Dogma. Everybody's heard of dogma. And what does dogma mean?
To my best view, I think. Yes, my best view is to my best view.
My best view.
Yeah, I think the original meaning.
The original meaning, exactly. Most people do not understand the original or etymological meaning of dogma. And in the introduction, the first few pages of the Esoteric Tradition, it was very fascinating. Dogma is a Greek word, and it is what was the general consensus of the ecclesia. And everybody's heard of ecclesiastical. And you all, I think all probably know that's associated with the church, specifically probably more the Catholic Church, around and so forth and so on. It needs to, I think it's very interesting to know the etymology of all words, but especially certain ones like this. It was Greek, and the ecclesia were the city council. The city councils, if you will, for lack of a better word, of the Greeks. And when they made a decision, like again our city councils, et cetera, whatever country, when they make a decision, their decision is dogma. Dogma in that it is that which is accepted as listening to everybody and everybody voting on it, pretty much democratic, if you will. This was the original meaning. And then you see, of course, what happened after that time. Now, GDP said, we do not have any dogmas in Theosophy. Not in the original sense, but in the sense that it is now. The colloquial is the fancy English word for meaning present or recent, or what is the accepted opinion. The colloquial opinion or idea of dogma, meaning this is it, the Pope said it, whoever said it, you got to believe it. There's none of this in Theosophy, according to GDP, if I'm quoting him correctly. Now, this does not mean, of course, he's going, but the original meaning of, well, there's consensus in thought and so forth, that's more so. But in the common parlance, it is not. Now, this does not mean, of course, there's not truth. There's certainly truth. And certainly, as he pointed out, as we all, I'm sure, read, the Mahatmas, those which are able to go into realms which are beyond the physical and have direct experience with our solar system especially, have experience. Through experience, again, the best teacher is experience. They have gone into these different realms. They have experienced it. But you, I should say I, and probably most of you here, maybe all of you, have not experienced this. And therefore, we have a right, and the Mahatmas certainly and GDP realize that if you've not really experienced something, you have a right to say, well, I'm not sure. But if you do know truth and you know it accurately, you do not need to back down. You should always stay to your ideals, and there is truth. And what GDP says and what the Mahatmas say probably is true. And again, I think so. But I cannot say from my own experience. And therefore, I respect people who have difference of opinion on these areas, because these are subjective, they're metaphysical, that meta means above the physical. They are areas which most of us, certainly myself, have no direct experience, and therefore have the right to not accept it or not, and still, I think, be very legitimate and good theosophists. So GDP pointed that out very strongly. Now, the anathematized teachings of Origen. Origen was a famous church father. Well, from the original, I bring him up, and GDP brings him up especially to emphasize how far back, and he gave a number of examples on how far back in the early Christian church, or Catholic church, if you will, that the thought of reincarnation existed. He gave a number of things, including the anathematization, which again means the condemnation, the meaning it's heresy, etc., of Origen, who was very famous, lived in Alexandria, was essentially, I don't know if he was a bishop, but he was a very high up type of person, highly respected, in about 200 to 300 AD, something in that range. And I'm going to point out some of them. Next slide, please. GDP also talks about Josephus, a Jewish well-known person, scholar, religious person, and other areas which show that, yes, there was the concept and thought of reincarnation at that time, early in the Christian church. But I think these three I pointed out especially that were important, that you can give to individuals in the Christian church, Christian thought, that yes, we do have documentations very early by very respected people saying there is reincarnation. First, I will read this. The first one was the pre-existence of the soul before its present life, and the ultimate restoration to the original spiritual nature and condition. I'm not going to list all 15, only these three. And number 3, the sun, the moon, the stars, and the other heavenly bodies are the visible encasements of spirits, now more or less degenerated from their condition and state. So that yes, it was felt very strongly by him and certainly by the Romans that the planets and the sun, etc., did have higher states of consciousness that we do not see directly in the physical, totally. You see some, but not total. And 13, that the soul of Christ pre-existed like the souls of all men. And that Christ is similar in type to all men in power and substance. Now, I would think that most of the fundamental Christians would not like to hear this. Okay, next slide. Are you ready for this? Am I blocking? Thoughts do not originate in a person's mind. After all that we heard about the brain, etc., he says this. No thought was ever created in the human brain. Our entire constitutional being is like an immensely sensitive photographic film, constantly renewed and constantly receiving and retaining impressions. Thoughts are energies, embodied energies, elemental energies. These elemental entities pass through the sensitive transmitting apparatus which our mind is. Now, does anybody have any problems with this? I want some feedback on this one.
You could put the last sentence, which your brain is.
Yes, please.
Well, you could change the title to be brain, because there is a higher mind, and your first statement does say that about the human brain. And then there's something more to elemental entities, but of course, with the talk we heard up there about heart math and that all the organs have intelligence, it could be true that these elemental entities affect that aspect. And so that is now, with that perspective, true. But I still feel inclined to change to apparatus, which our brain is.
Which apparatus, which our brain is. Any other comments or thoughts about this?
The first one is a very important one, because you can conclude from this that although we think that we are able to invent a lot of things, it is not true. We just receive things.
Any other ideas?
It's good that you took that quote, because we can see that our thoughts are in fact our family. They are our younger brothers, and they are reincarnating within our constitution. And we have, by that, a very large responsibility for them, how they can live.
Any other ideas?
Knowing this, I think if we are aware of that, we can focus our thoughts on what you receive and what you receiving and send. I think it's okay being aware of that. You can control the process. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Nicholas?
Well, I was just thinking about I don't know if it's an exact quote, photographic film constantly renewed and constantly receiving and retaining impressions. And if that's what he said, then that would mean that our auric envelope has its own supply from over lifetimes. Therefore, in that sense, we can use that pool to originate, modify. So it's not literally, in all the samsara we've been through, all the many lifetimes, that, and I won't say there's nothing original, there's nothing original, but we do have our own supply of thoughts that we attract and then make use of or not. So that's, I would put that asterisk next to it.
Thank you, Nicholas. And there's a gentleman there.
Well, the idea that souls are living beings which are all around us, and that they have different qualities, and that we can attune ourselves to certain kinds of souls which have a certain lack of spiritual level or do contain a certain level of spirituality, makes it very interesting to keep in mind where you are with your thoughts, and that if thoughts pass through your mind and you add something, or you are able in certain situation to add something to the quality of thoughts, which is then once again received by some other people, it gives you as a person the responsibility always to contribute to the utmost of your capabilities of improving the quality of thoughts. And that's something which is also heavily discussed in some of our courses which we have to prepare people to get a better understanding of Theosophy. So that is an element of major importance, the idea thoughts are living beings which have their own growth process, and we grow with our thoughts.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yes,
Erwin?
Richard, over here. No?
I'm sorry, Josh.
Yeah, not at all, not at all. Sorry, Evan. Sorry. My first ideas here when reading this, I thought, well, I'm missing somebody in the whole picture. It does look now kind of an automatic process. Thoughts are coming in and thoughts are going out. But I'm missing something. And it's perhaps something in line what Jan mentioned just a minute ago. I mean, somebody has to be added to this whole picture, I believe. The person or the ego directing all these thoughts.
Something needs to be added. Okay. And now, Erwin, did you want?
Well, yesterday we also heard about Tingley, who, how do you say, hindered the use of newspapers during the Second World War? First World War, yeah, thank you. Well, the Second World War would probably also be a good idea. And I think we have to see that also in this perspective, and how important it is to also be conscious of your function as a transmitter. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I
thank
need a little help to transfer my words in English. My English is not so best. What I'm trying to say is that I completely agree with your thoughts here, but I miss something, that not everybody gets the same thoughts and get out the same thoughts. There is something else what make the thoughts come in and the thoughts go out.
It's called your will or desire.
Yes, but what you say? Will?
What you want to think, what you direct your karma, your desire, your will towards, that's the types of thoughts you'll bring in.
Probably I thought more on the character of the human. Character.
Yes,
Yes?
character. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, John?
GDP makes it fairly clear in the esoteric teachings that everything is really streams of elemental essence. And we only get entities when something interacts with that elemental essence. It's even true of particles in our world. They don't really exist until there is some interaction with it. So thoughts are really the interaction of these elementals. They aren't the thoughts. They're only interacting with our accumulated, what we like to call matter, which of course isn't really here. And it's that interaction of the flow that causes the thoughts. And you're correct, whatever you happen to be in your character, you'll interact in a different way and get a different thought.
Thank you. Anybody else?
And we also discussed the thoughts a lot, and that the thoughts can be nutrition for higher consciousness. So if we concentrate more on the Buddhic thoughts, and we also feed the gods.
Thank you. Anyone else? Someone? Oh, yeah.
I was thinking that what you said earlier about a teacher accesses that which they have experienced, and therefore it's true. But that is what is within our AE. Every incarnation is a pearl. and the pearls of the accumulated wisdom within our own AEs. So the individual's will would connect easier to the truth of ideas that way. I think that, for me, that would be, let's call it the missing part. But the use of the elemental essences and the reality that is given in a life becomes the reality of the AE, which we are.
Thank you. Anyone else? This lady over here.
I would say when you read this thing, it's kind of an exercise constantly to think in hierarchies. So we are used to set ourselves as a human being as the start of everything that is of the, wat zeg je, uitgangspunt? The starter's point of everything that is around us and we see. But there are also other hierarchies where the same processes are. And when you bear this in mind, this thought can be more, becomes more convenient.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, so I'm going to make a few comments here. My opinion, and hopefully is accurate, and hopefully does follow GDP. First, again, we heard in Julian about the brain, et cetera, and the brain deals with the emotions, the brain deals with the thinking, deals with the memory, deals with everything. So now we hear this. We have a dilemma here. First, there's no question in my mind that the brain is absolutely necessary for thinking. Like a radio receiver is necessary in hearing the radio station. In other words, yes, obviously there's physical things, reflexes, hormones, et cetera, which the brain does respond to directly, the heart, et cetera. There's no question about that. You cannot think and function without a brain. But you have to look at it in the proper context, the proper meaning, the proper association. It is like, in my opinion, in my own lack of technical knowledge and words, I will say it's like a radio receiver, like a television set, et cetera. It is picking up energies, it is picking up visions, it is picking up ideas that are out there, but are not all in the brain. Now, in a very crude way, and the way I'm afraid my mind thinks a little bit, if I can say that, it's hard for me to think this mush up here came up with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And we can go on and on and on. Yes, I cannot see that this, and I very, very much respect, and I think it's beautiful, the brain, et cetera. And it's a magnificent organ. But at the same time, it has its limitations. And these subtle ideas, musical, et cetera, I think are from other realms. And again, we're picking this up. In other words, I'm trying to come up with some kind of common sense, something that people can put their finger on that makes sense. Can you really think the brain can produce all this beautiful art and music and science and all this stuff? Do you think it has that potential? Just through common sense. No one's found it in there. They've dissected the brain all over the place. They've done this and that. And that. They don't find any ideas or thoughts in there. They can get certain reactions and emotions. But again, that's because also, to at least some extent, it's associated with its transmission process, like a radio or receiver. And yes, when you have a stroke, et cetera, you lose part of that radio and receiver and you can't function. Not only, of course, when it comes to physical things, that's no problem. I mean, if you can't move your arm, no biggie. But when it comes to the mental and emotional, that's where they get more into trouble, as to saying the brain is the whole enchilada. That's my opinion, and I think that's GDP's opinion. So in other words, this to me was one of the most important things I've ever read. that my ideas are coming from another area. Yes, I bring them to me, and I will go over them. I put them in the whatever out there, and I'll bring them back when I need to go over certain things that I've learned, which is really those thought elementals, those entities, these living entities, are out there, which I bring back, and I influence, and then I throw them back out there, which I can do for the better or the worse. And this is more down to earth, if you will, reason why it's so important to keep your mind and emotions in a very high place, because you're influencing the rest of humanity by the way you think. We don't think so. Oh, well, I'm doing this or that bad thing. It's just affecting me. No. And when you once realize this, then you got something to put your finger on, saying, well, I should act the right way, because I'm influencing a lot of nice people out there and the environment, as was brought out again in Julian on the scientific aspect by Knope and Rollins and so forth. We now can measure electromagnetic energy going out at least from our heart to, 3 feet or so? They can do that right now. It's probably more, but they don't have the proper instrument. We see the influence of the sun on certain things happening with the sun, this and that. We see all this influence. We have black and white. Probably, I'll say our best. I may be stretching it. But I think our best ally is science. And GP certainly said one of the most important, but I'll even say the best. Science is helping Theosophy probably more than anything else. We are getting these things black and white, if you will, that nobody from whatever, religious whatever, can say is wrong, because we have good, solid scientific evidence. So we know that we're influencing out there with the electromagnetic, the full hot, et cetera, those energies. Those are affecting the universe, and affecting more specifically the solar system and our Earth. And yes, as GDP said, even the storms and other things of this sort, earthquakes perhaps, are affected by us. We can cause them. Very, very, very profound thoughts. If you carry them through, then you're going to have more than, well, my mom told me to be good. You know, you really see how important it is on how you act. And then when you realize there's reincarnation and karma, you are going to want to be in line. There are 1 trillion planets, 1 trillion planets in our galaxy. 1,000 billion planets. 150 times the population of this Earth, there are planets. There are 100 billion suns in our galaxy. We are going to be around a long time. And we want to be heading in the right direction. We don't want to have to go back to first grade again. Next slide. This is a very important subject that has been used, certainly. Monad, ego, soul, or ego. Ego is the proper Latin pronunciation. These are more important subjects which we've heard of a few times. But the definition of which I think is not clear in a lot of people's minds. I will give, of course, GDPs, which in my opinion is probably very good. But for instance, I was at Crotona. You know, I live in Ojai. For those that don't know exactly where Ojai is, that's in about 65 miles north of Los Angeles, near Ventura and Santa Barbara, in inland. It's a small town, about 8,000 people. But that town has every religion, every philosophy, and probably every science in the world. Anybody in the world has been in that town. You'll find somebody from some country in that town. That's where Krishnamurti was and has a school. The Adyar Society has its esoteric group there for the whole globe, its esoteric group is in Ojai. It's a half a mile from my house. I know everybody there. They're fine, fine people. Good people. And they, specifically one of their most important people there, not directly there, but with Adyar, was Michael Gomes, or is Michael Gomes. Does anybody not know Michael Gomes? Okay, he is an Adyar. He's done some work with Blavatsky's. He just came up with a new book on some new Blavatsky and so forth and so on. He was speaking at Crotona, which was named after Pythagoras. He was speaking there and he says, one of the most important things we need to understand, and is more important, and we need to get to understand more, is what a monad is. A monad, which again is a term taken from Leibniz. He was a German, I don't know what he was exactly, philosopher, etc. I'm not sure. But anyway, this is where the term came from, and of course Blavatsky talks about him. But Michael Gomes, highly respected, coming out with all kinds of stuff, talks on the secret doctrine, highly respected by Adyar, saying this as of last year. A Dr. Goswami, if I'm pronouncing the name right, who is a professor of physics in Oregon, has come to Crotona a number of times to present. He was also in the, what the heck do I know? What was the movie? You know which movie I'm talking about? What the Bleak. What the Bleak. He was in that movie. He says, we have to start thinking of monads to get a proper term of what's going on in the quantum physics, etc. So this is becoming a very important, now GDP especially has made a big deal out of this. And I think we need to understand that term clearly. So I'm going to go through it line by line. It's not too long, a couple of paragraphs. But I think many of you know it, but I think it's good to understand exactly what the meaning is. Next slide, please. First, actually, you had the monadic essence, which is above the monad. Monadic essence is virtually equivalent to the term God. There being as many gods as there are monads. HBB alludes in the secret doctrine to the three fundamental bases of consciousness and the basic structural framework of the universe. She speaks of gods, monads, and atoms. A trichotomy, which reminds us of the familiar trichotomy, elsewhere alluded to as spirit, soul, and body. The spirit corresponding to God, and the atom here corresponding to body. Excuse me, I'm going to get some water. All the way over here. Okay. So monadic essence is meant to be vague. GDP specifically leaves it vague because he doesn't want to crystallize the term what a God is. But it is the highest aspect in whatever hierarchy you have, which of course all hierarchies are infinite. There's an infinite amount of hierarchies. Next slide. Now specifically a monad is a spiritual entity which to us humans is indivisible. Mono means one. It is divine, a divine spiritual life atom. But indivisible because its essential characteristic, as we humans conceive it, is homogeneity. Homogeneity means no divisibility. Like homogeneous, from again, like in the Greek, homos means like. While that of the physical atom, above which our consciousness soars, is divisible, is a composite heterogeneous. Hetero means more than one. Particle. Monads are eternal, unitary, individual, life centers, consciousness centers, deathless during any solar manvantara. Now, manvantara is again the beginning of a solar system to the end of a solar system is a manvantara. And that's, of course, billions, trillions of years, whatever. Therefore, ageless, unborn, undying during that time. Consequently, each one of such, and their number is infinite, is the center of the all. For the divine or the all is that which has its center everywhere and its circumference or limiting boundaries nowhere. That's a monad. Next slide. The ego, which means I in Latin, I, the accumulated or stored up or treasured fund of consciousness, conscious evolutionary experience, gained during the continuously succeeding and repetitive embodiments of a monad in the manifested worlds. Thus, as an illustration, and taking HBB's term, the reincarnating ego is the gatherer, and indeed itself is the storehouse of all the spiritual and intellectual experiences gained by the human monad in and through its many different incarnations and embodiments in the worlds of manifestation. Next slide. Soul is the sentient, sensitive, living vehicle or garment or veil, itself a living substance with which the ego surrounds itself during any embodiment. Another name for soul is body. Not necessarily the body of flesh and bones, although it can be, but any garment or veil or vehicle in and through which and on whatever plane of the human constitution an ego may be expressing itself. Hence we see the common usage so favored by GDP in his writings of the various terms spiritual soul, human soul, animal soul, and even physical soul, the latter meaning ordinary body of flesh. And now I'll give you the summary, and we'll move on. Next. Thus, from the above statements, the essential divine spiritual stuff, or essence, again he leaves that vague, or substance which itself, a God, when expressing itself as an individual on the next inferior plane, is a monad. So the next plane down, the monadic essence or God is a monad. Such monad expresses itself on the plane on which it may be manifesting through its appropriate spiritual, intellectual, monastic veil or garment or egoic focus, which is its ego. And each such ego, as above stated, in its turn surrounds itself with its swabhavically characteristic vital garment or veil or living substance or sensitive self. The soul. The soul is what is sensitive, what feels, whatever plane it's on. Swabhava, again, means the unfolding of the self, the high self, the divine self. Every monad, every life atom, etc., everything, every entity has this swabhava to try to reach and evolve to the highest and most divine part of that hierarchy. And always all hierarchies start with the divine. Any comments or questions on that? It's a lot of stuff. I know it's technical, and we can move on. Next slide. Evolution and revolution. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Okay. The revolution of the rounds, the evolution of the different principles, etc., etc. All that I think is very clear. But I'm going to throw in one thing here, which DB brings out, which is said almost nowhere else that I know of. And this is called ontogeny, which is this is a very interesting concept that, again, the esoteric tradition brings out ideas that you will find very little elsewhere that I think are very important and apropos to evolution. Ontogeny means the examination of the embryo, the first 8 weeks of gestation of the pregnancy, and sees whether it recapitulates the race picture. In this case, we'll stick strictly with humans, but you can do it with any other animal. He touches on this in the esoteric tradition, but he goes into more detail in a book called Man and Evolution. Now, this thought was brought up at an ITC conference in Philadelphia a few years ago. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I want to bring out just a couple of essential things that I think very few of you will know, and I think, again, will make you appreciate this particular work. Next slide. There was 10 things listed in this book showing that human beings came before the apes, not after the apes, or the more general term is primates. And the closest primate to us is the chimpanzee. It's only 1% off of our genetic makeup as far as the DNA and RNA. It's that close. But the question, of course, society, for as a general rule, says, all right, we all know that humans came from apes, so that's why it's so close. But here we bring out some black and white evidence. This, which I said, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, was used by Hegel and Darwin. This was on their pedestal. They got down and worshipped it every morning. So it was highly respected, the idea, at that time. So by examining the human embryo, we should be able to see the whole evolution of from the salamanders, the amphibians, and the fish, etc. We can see the picture of the human until we get to human. But there's one thing that doesn't add up. And there was 10 that was listed by a Dr. Wood Jones, who was a British anatomist in the early 1900s. He found out 10 things that are not consistent with this thought that are very important. I will only do one. The most important, in my opinion, the most obvious. The human foot. If you look at the human foot and you look at the human hand, you will see two major differences. Number one, the thumb is called prehensile. It does this. The toe, the large toe, which is consistent with this, does not do that in any way, shape, or form. The longest finger in the hand is the third finger. The longest toe on the foot is the first or second, never the third. Also the general shape of the foot, etc., etc. Now all the primates are quadrumanos. They're five-handed, or four-handed. All of them can do with their big toe this. All of them have the third toe, the largest. It is extremely important because humans naturally walk upright. Apes do not. They can do it, but their knuckles, they walk on their knuckles. This is the way they naturally like to walk. Okay, so the fact that we can stand is very important, and the foot is very important. Next slide. Oh, actually, hold on, please. Do I have a pointer here? You will see here, this is 48 days, as I say. The gestation, or the embryonic period, is 8 weeks. That's 56 days. You're very close to the very end. And you see the tail here? A week before the end of embryonic stage, you have a tail, meaning this is very, very old in the embryonic stage. It's around the time we were amphibians, or during the amphibian development to the human form. And so it's very late. You will never see at any time and during the embryonic period that the foot looks like a hand in a human being. Never. And if the apes came before us, then we should see it look like a hand before you get to a foot, a regular foot, a human foot. It never does that. I sent this information out to 100 primatologists. The information of Wood Jones, etc. I took out everything that said anything about Theosophy. It was strictly what you see anatomically. It has nothing to do with religion or anything. I did not get a large response. I got maybe 5 back. But one of them was from Harvard, and I have that paper. Harvard School of Primatology or Archaeology, whatever it was. I forget what it was. He agreed, and no one, as a matter of fact, sent anything back saying I was wrong or what was said here was wrong. Nobody, including them. He says, I had that trouble too. I could not figure out why the foot did not look like a hand before it turned to a foot. But then he says, well, we don't pay that much attention to that because we know the chimpanzees only 1% off from the genetic makeup of humans, therefore it's not important. He did not say it was inaccurate. He said it just wasn't important. He says, because they're finding some of these problems, now they're going strictly by genetic, and ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, we aren't looking so closely at anymore. Okay? I'll leave it at that. Next slide. First few days of the embryo. Next, please. In the tail. Next. Next. So anyway, we'll leave it at that. Heavens and hells. Another important area. And yes, this is explored. The bottom line is that yes, heaven and hells are relative. There is no eternal heaven or eternal hell. I like some common sense thought on this too. As I'm saying, I've never met a person in my life that I would feel deserves to be burned for eternity, and I question anybody else has. We'll start off with basics. I've also never met anyone in my life who's so good that they deserve to have eternity of having just a great time. This is just basic down to earth. This has nothing to do with GDP as such. But I just throw that out there. Next slide. A famous English biblical scholar and Hebraeus, Dr. John Lightfoot, 17th century, stated the following. Heaven and earth, center and circumference, were made in the same instance of time, and clouds full of water, and a man was created by the Trinity on the 25th of October, 4004 BC, at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Eastern time.
He was highly respected. He was off by a couple of minutes, but otherwise, no, seriously. But you see how ridiculous some of this has been. And he was highly respected. Next slide. So, again, GDP points out the 7 globes, and actually GDP says there are 12 globes in the planetary chain, in all planetary chains. And this, of course, is some newer information, not really said directly to my knowledge in the secret doctrine, alluded to perhaps, but I don't think HPB said this, and this, of course, is fine for anybody to disagree with. But he does. And as you can see, they're associated with the different constellations. Our Earth, Globe D, is associated specifically, interestingly enough, with Saturn and the constellation Capricorn. So different planets and so forth and so on. So next slide. A couple of some technical things. I'll go through this very quickly. I think a lot of us know this. Tattva. So tat is that. Tat gives value or noun of substantial. It essentially means thatness. It is energy, substance, basis of all derivatives. Next, please. Again, there's 7 cosmical tattvas which deal with the consciousness matter aspect. Next slide. Tattvas are cosmical or universal principles or elements. Tattvas and lokas and talas are in essence virtually identical. Lokas and talas are the representative manifestations of their corresponding tattvas. Tattvas originate the others. Next slide. Loka is a place or a world. Tala is an inferior world. Lokas and talas are inseparable. Loka is more spiritual, a principle. Talas are more material, substance, or element. So, in other words, he gave some specific information on heavens and hells. That which is more spiritual, lokas, that which is more hell, if you will, or more material, is talas. And so this is another way of looking at it. The GDP brought out some other information I think is important, and again gives some significance to the importance that heaven and hell is truly a relative term. Our earth is certainly in many ways a hell, and in other ways it's a heaven. So this is some interesting information. Next slide. Great seers versus visionaries. Some good information here. Practical information. He went into the various Buddhas, the messengers, etc., etc., and pointed out the differences of different grades, and I will not go into all those details. But what I want to especially point out, which is very practical and very important to look at in the real world, because as we all know, there are a number of different people out there saying, well, okay, I'm channeling this and I'm doing that and I'm really, really high up there. I really am a person you need to listen to. Well, they may be more modest than that. So how do you tell the difference? And again, the bottom line is this. Teachings of universal principles in which every religion and philosophy has comprised in its origin when first formulated by some great sage or seer. When this is looked at by any particular visionary, any particular person who's supposed to have spiritual consciousness, if it does not encompass the universal aspect dealing with all religions and philosophy, if it does not ring harmonious with them, then you should question it and question whether you're really in the right area. So it should encompass all religions and philosophies, and certainly Theosophy has made this statement a number of times. It again is up to the individual as to whether they feel it is true or not. Next slide. Ether. Now this is a very important subject. Again, associated a lot with what was said on, I believe it was Saturday. Again, Job was speaking of Fohat, which is, again, the electricity, the energy to draw. And again, Job, please correct me and add anything you wish along the way here. But also ether is something that we should be looking at and is talked about a lot and is a very difficult subject, which DDP has said more than 2 or 3 times in the book. It's hard to use the right words to define this. He admittedly says that. And the European languages are not good at presenting this thought. But it's very important that we get a good knowledge of this, and it's very apropos again to Fohat, electromagnetic forces, etc. Because ether deals with cosmic consciousness as is all permeate, all penetrating everything. However, it may also be 2 billion times the density of lead. Next slide. Akasha, Mula Prakriti. Akasha is the higher aspect of ether. The higher aspect, that is Mula Prakriti, which is root matter. The fifth cosmic element. called ether by the ancients. So we have the very highest aspect of ether called akasha, and we have the lower aspect often more associated with ether. Next slide. Ether and ether. Cosmic consciousness is cosmic force, and force and matter are fundamentally the same, or identical. This force is denser and more compact than the densest matter and yet it is incomparably more tenuous or subtle or light, or very tenuous again, and more ethereal, precisely because it is both. This is a difficult concept. Ether permeates everything. The atom is mainly empty space, according to science. This empty space is ether. And it can be, again, in the higher realms, more akasha. It varies from the most subtle or tenuous to the most dense. It's I think they said, I forget how many billion times more than lead. If it permeates everything, it has to be able to get in every part of the universe. And lead and so forth is very, very dense for us, and yet it has to be even less, has to be able to get in through that and be so concentrated they can get in through all this narrow space, so to speak, which makes it even more dense than lead. It is a difficult concept, and I will leave it at that. It is something which we will not resolve now. It's something I've given a lot of thought to here and there.
Should?
Yes.
Over here,
yes.
John.
Yeah, questions anytime.
I think we tend to confuse density with weight, and we think of lead being dense when really it's not the most dense element we have. It's heavy, but it's not even the heaviest. So something can be dense, and if the individual particles of that substance are weightless, the entire mass of it is still weightless. So I think the key to that, what you're struggling with there, is the confusion of the weight of what we think is dense matter is not the same.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Can you give an example of dense material or dense something? Okay. Can you give an example of density? What is more dense than lead?
Example, what is more dense material?
Well, mercury is more dense than lead. It's much heavier per unit mass. So density has to do with how compact the atoms are. But if the atoms are light, like you could take even hydrogen and bring it down to absolute zero, it will be more dense than lead, but it'll still be a superfluid because of how close the particles, the individual atoms are together. So it's not got to do with weight.
Thank you. And Nope, or Joop, rather.
Yeah, I've always also thought of it as density as being indeed packed close together. But then we have also to take into account, if we use these words as they are spelled here, that we are not only relating to the plane of physical substance we are used to, but also may, if we spell it with A-E-T-H-E-R, of another plane where this may apply to, and then if it's 2 billion times denser than lead, so to speak, and on the other hand it is also very tenuous, then I understand the full picture. Only if it has something to do with other planes or other types of substance.
Thank you. Anybody else? It is a difficult subject, as I said, and again, GDP says that. It is one which, again, I want to bring out because this is something which, again, you will see not a lot written, and it's good to go over this more than a few times. Next slide. Radioactive elements. What is going on with radioactive elements? I asked that question to you.
Situation?
In stable situations? Well, basically the general concept, why do we have and what is going on? What is the reason why we have radioactive elements?
Radioactive elements are basically a problem with the packing fraction when you pack the neutrons and protons together, and mass is lost or gained in the process. And when you multiply, say, the neutrons in a nucleus, you get to an unstable state, and that nucleus will tend to split. And when it splits, it releases either beta, alpha, or gamma particles, so-called gamma rays. And that's the source of the radioactivity from an innate instability. If you chart them on a chart, you have many nucleotides that are the same element, and many of them are radioactive of every element in the chart. And it's only some of those that are stable, so-called, and don't spontaneously split. Is that enough?
Thank you, John. That's good. Any other comments on why we have radioactive material or elements?
What I have till now understood is that radioactive elements are elements that are at the end of their evolutionary period. They are going to another plane of the planetary chain.
They're at the end of their evolutionary period and they're going to another plane?
Yes.
Okay. Any other comments? John?
Am I on? Okay. I don't really believe that's correct because the particle breaks into two pieces and those are still on this plane. It loses energy if it's fission, an enormous amount of energy, and it withdraws energy if it's fusion. It requires a lot of energy to set it off. But they are both the decay products and the material that started remain on this physical plane. So I'm not quite sure how you understand that.
On the physical plane you are right, but we are talking about consciousness. And the consciousness is going to a higher plane, and the remnants are on this level.
So the element is dying? Is that what you're saying? The element is dying in order to its inner constitution go somewhere else? Is that what you mean?
Is that what you're saying? Yes.
Yeah, I would say it's the ray of the consciousness that was first during its phase of embodied existence, the emanation process where it is attracting all this matter to form a vehicle to manifest on this plane, and when this ray of consciousness is withdrawn, the coherent force is disappearing, and what remains may become the vehicle of some other type of consciousness that use that part as a vehicle. It seems to me all fitting together.
Does that have anything to do with ether?
Fusion is another thing, but that is from a source outside. This is a spontaneous process.
What I understood is it has also to do with the ascending arc, so that the Earth as an entity has had his most material phase, and we are just starting a little bit at the first beginnings of the ascending arc, which means that in general all consciousness tend to be spiritualized. And what consciousnesses are the first which do not follow that stream, that are the most material consciousnesses. Those cannot go on during the spiritualizing process, and they have nothing to learn here anymore, and they die out. So somehow it is a kind of a dying out of two material consciousnesses. In this case, plutonium, uranium, all that kind.
Thank you. Ken?
Not my subject, but I do clearly remember GDP being very clear that the rate, he was very emphatic that the rate of the radioactive element decay is not fixed. And I don't think any of these wonderful scientists amongst our Theosophical group have addressed that, and I don't know the answer to that, but I'm quite sure Peruker said that.
Thank
Am I
you,
wrong,
Ken?
Herman?
That the rate is not fixed, that it varies, Ken?
Yeah, and it has to do with the descending and ascending arc, which is why I'm quite sure of that also. He mentions it specifically, as I remember it, when speaking about dating of carbon dating, but it would apply to the other things as well, I would think. Yeah? No?
Yeah.
Yes? No? I don't know.
If you look in nature, you see that the process is, in principle, a process to come to the nearest stability or the nearest stable situation. So you see the elements is throwing off only the overmass, the overweight. So it is not splitting in itself, it is throwing off the overweight. And then you get a number of, let's say, steps to the next stable situation. And the stable situation is not for all elements the same. So if you take uranium, that is the heaviest, let's say, natural element we have. I don't want to speak about plutonium and all the other stuff because that is artificial. Then you see that there are a number of situations to come to a stable form in lead. And then you see in nature that you see a number of different type of lead atoms they're coming from the same, let's say, line of stability. From Theosophical point of view, you can say the following thing, that the element, the consciousness, the outer mass or the body of the consciousness works to the next stable situation what fits in our state of evolution. And that is a very inspiring teaching because that means that we see everywhere in nature the transitions. And it teaches us immediately that if we go and process in the, let's say, the higher levels, growing into the higher levels, there become more and more situations that we see also in nature, lines to get to the nearest or the next stability for their state of evolution. So in itself, it is a quite, let's say, a very good explanation. If you go into all the artificial elements like plutonium and einsteinium and so on, that is in fact a story that we create situations what also already exist in the past and don't want to exist very much in this situation. And that is the reason that becomes very dangerous because they throw off a lot in a small time. But I think you have to start from the consciousness point of view.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Just a question I was thinking, could that be in any way analogous on a much higher level to a Buddha, for example, leaving behind its bodhisattva principles? You know, you were told in personal terms that it was deliberate. He left it behind. But perhaps it's almost automatic that at a certain point it cannot be taken here, because she also says once you get into the Dharmakaya state, you can't come back, as it were. So is there something analogous there maybe to what we're talking about?
Absolutely, absolutely. You find it back in the teachings of GDP when he speaks as well that if we process in the evolution, certain type of people, gross people, not growing in the same speed or staying behind, are not able to manifest anymore, and they drop at sleep and have to wait until the next big cycle to, how do you want to say that, retry it again to hook on. Yeah. So in principle, that is the same teaching. Only what we now speaking about by elements, we apply it to physical particles, but it is the same principle idea. Yeah.
I'm very grateful to Herman to bring out the consciousness phase, because in reading the new edition of the Transactions, HPB clearly shows it's not just force and matter, but motion. And then she asks her students, and what is motion? It's life and consciousness. And this is the third factor sometimes we're missing, that she arrives at, or at least tries to stir to the attention of her students in those last days.
Can I join Dara in comment? What I tried to tell everyone here yesterday about the life of the Theosophical Society fits perfectly in what you bring now, Richard, because the society also has its evolution of the spiritual side in the upward arc and the involution of the material side. And Ben started by saying, look at the consciousness side, and then it's more obvious what happens with the material side. If we say we lose members, you can see that as a, how do you call it, an atomic reaction, yes, like that, radioactivity, but it is meant to grow riper spiritually, for that is what we had to do in the upward arc. And then our material things etherealized, is that an American word? Something more. Yes, so you can put this whole discussion on the Theosophical Society as well. And then it's so much easier to see what happens in some situation in history and in the future.
Thank you very much, I think. And now we fly back later on with the idea, a little bit of shame, because we have a lot of members.
Can I react on that? What I like to explain yesterday is also what Sieglinde says. We are now in the second heartbeat of our Theosophical Society. It's time again to expand. And we can use all our experience from the first heartbeat not to fall in the same pits again. We can do it better this time.
Right. We have a mic over here.
Yeah.
Please.
I'm curious, is this explain why the moon is nefarious in some of its effects? Because it's transferred its more spiritual parts to the new chain? I mean, I'm taking moon in a generic sense.
Say that one more time.
The moon has nefarious effects, toxic effects.
Yes.
Parts of it. But it transferred its higher spiritualized forms out of that Laya point to this chain.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Okay.
I mean, is that let's call it an idea of how this, what it expresses itself through our elements?
I think there's a relationship there. And again, comments, I'll be happy to give my own opinion, but I like to hear other people's comments. Again, on radioactive elements, as well as the moon, which is part of that process.
I just did a quick check on the internet on my iPhone.
I tell you, do not get along without Eldon.
And
Eldon knows all the computers.
There's a reference in the Esoteric Tradition, Volume 1, page 325 to 327, that suggests that radioactivity is a process of the physical world etherealizing, and it occurs on the ascending arc or progress away from materiality. So if we can go to page 325 of Volume 1, there should be a reference to radioactivity.
Thank you, Elda. Any other comments? Okay, I think that's enough. Yes, agree or not agree, that's of course up to every person. But GDP said that yes, this is another sign that these are the heavier elements, if I can use that term, the ones with the more protons, et cetera, et cetera. And they are starting to, the word was die, but what does death mean? Huh? What does death mean? What happens when some entity dies?
Transition to another level.
Yes. Yes.
But not necessarily permanently.
Not necessarily permanent.
Initiation and death are different.
He got you, Nicholas. Okay. Yeah, so again, death is nothing but a change of consciousness, a change of plane, et cetera, et cetera. We all know that. So yes, these minerals are going, the idea is again, we're going in the spiritual arc up now. We passed the fourth root race on the fourth round and so forth. We're on heading up to the spiritual, and therefore that which is mostly material, the most gross and most material, are the first that are going to suffer, if you will. Or really, maybe they'll be good after they leave this plane, and they'll have a good time. Anyway, the bottom line is that these, at least what GDP says, is that these heavy elements are starting to break up. Parts of them, not all of them. But it's a slow process, a gradual process. And these are signs of what is happening, that we are moving up the spiritual level. And those which are more material and more, as far as the animal aspect, as I think we've heard too, the animals become less and less as we evolve. Because they cannot handle the higher monastic mind and Buddhic energies that will become more and more prominent as we evolve. Okay, anything else on that? We have time for another slide? Oh, good.